Trains are meant to change tracks. But that night, one erased a life. Someone saw something. Or thought they did. Just a glimpse. A moment. And then everything vanished into darkness. But some secrets, like railway lines, bend without breaking. And when they rise again, they don't just bring back the truth. They destroy lives. The question isn't who committed the murder. The real question is, why did she choose that exact moment to kill, knowing someone was watching? That December evening was unlike any other. There was something strange in the air, a chill that carried not just the bite of rain, but a vague sense of foreboding, as if the weather itself was part of a hidden story waiting to unfold. It was nearly 5 o'clock, when the 4:50 train from Paddington slowed down at the quiet, aging station of St. Mary Mead. But this time, the usual calm that blanketed the platform felt oddly disturbed, like a silence trying too hard to stay silent. Each drop of rain that hit the window pane sounded less like water and more like a whisper, urgent, insistent, almost like a warning from something unseen. Only a few passengers stepped off the train, but among them was the unmistakable figure of Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, an older, dignified woman with a sturdy frame, and a gaze sharp enough to slice through any lie. She carried the exhaustion of a day's Christmas shopping in London, her arms heavy with parcels and bags, her breath short from the weight of it all. But something deeper than physical fatigue darkened her expression, something unspoken. The cold wind that greeted her on the platform didn't just tug at her coat, it seemed to brush against her soul, carrying with it a strange unease. "Chilly evening, madam," the porter said, tipping his hat. "Especially with Christmas just a week away," she replied wearily, her voice steady but drained. When she asked about a taxi, the porter shook his head. "No taxis at this hour, I'm afraid. But I could ring for one," she refused gently. "Miss Marple is expecting me." She sent Jim, with the wheelbarrow, and almost as if summoned by her words, Jim appeared, hunched, weathered like old stone, but with eyes that had clearly seen and remembered too much. He loaded her things into the barrow, and they began the slow walk along the winding path that led to the cottage, a path that once held warm memories for Elspeth, but tonight felt unnaturally still, as if the trees and hedges were quietly hiding something. The cottage stood in the distance, its windows glowing with the soft light of a fire and a reading lamp, like a beacon in the night, or a fragile illusion of peace. As they approached, the front door opened, and there stood Miss Jane Marple, frail and white-haired, but with an unshakable clarity in her eyes that made you feel she knew everything before you said a word. "Elspeth, you're soaked. Come inside, quickly." Moments later, Mrs. McGillicuddy sat by the fire, wrapped in a warm blanket, a hot toddy cradled in her hands, yet her face remained pale, her eyes frozen wide, as though haunted by something she couldn't forget. "You're trembling," Miss Marple noted. "Was it very cold on the train?" "No," Elspeth whispered, her voice tight. "It wasn't the cold. It was something else. Something I can't explain. I witnessed a murder, Jane. On the train." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been clicking steadily, fell completely still, like the air itself pausing to listen. "A murder. Yes. Our train had stopped for a signal. Another train passed us slowly, heading the opposite direction. I happened to be looking out of the window, and well, their blinds were open too. For just a moment, the two trains ran side by side, perfectly aligned. Through the window of the carriage across from mine, I saw a man standing with his back to me. Both his hands were around a woman's neck. He was strangling her, Jane. I could see her face contorted, her eyes bulging, her mouth open as if screaming, but no sound. Nothing. And then in an instant, it was all gone. The train separated. The moment passed. She paused, her hands shaking. I ran to the conductor immediately. I told him everything, but he just looked at me like I was mad. He said they couldn't stop the train, that the other train had already gone too far. He asked me which train it was. what the man looked like, the woman's name, the carriage number. I couldn't answer. I didn't know. All I knew was what I had seen in her eyes. Death. I know what I saw, Jane. It was real. And if I stay silent now, I fear someone else may die next. The fire crackled faintly, casting flickering shadows across the sitting room walls, but the warmth couldn't reach the chill that had settled deep in Mrs. Everleigh Stone's bones as she sat forward, hands clenched in her lap, knuckles pale with tension. Her voice trembled as she began. I only saw him from the back. He was tall, yes, taller than most men, broad across the shoulders, and he wore this long heavy overcoat, dark, charcoal, or black maybe. But it was his posture, Jane, his posture. So calm, so utterly composed, like he'd done this before. There was no struggle in his movement, just deliberation. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard before continuing. The woman, oh, I couldn't see her face clearly, not at first, but her hair was pale, light, I think. But then in that single frozen moment as the train passed ours, her head turned and I saw. She stopped, eyes wide with horror. Her face, Jane, it was twisted, contorted in pain, the color of bruised plums. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her eyes bulging, lifeless. It was monstrous. She shuddered, wrapping her shawl tighter. When I arrived at Halbert Station, I reported it straight away. The station master was polite enough, nodded, let me speak, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe a word. He probably thought I'd dozed off and had a nightmare, or worse, dipped into a bit too much sherry on the train. That must have been very distressing, Miss Verena Hartwell said softly, watching her old friend with sharp understanding eyes. What happened after that? Nothing, Everleigh said, bitterness curling in her voice. Not a single thing. They dismissed me, Jane, like I was some silly old woman with nothing better to do than imagine horrors. Perhaps I can't even blame them. It's an extraordinary story, I know. If it hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't believe it either. But I believe you, Verena said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of certainty that made Everleigh look up, a flicker of gratitude in her weary gaze. I knew you would. We've known each other too long for anything less. Yes, Verena said with a slight nod. And people like us, well, we're not known for flights of fantasy. If you say you saw it, then you did. That's the end of it. Everleigh exhaled shakily. But even if you believe me, Jane, what does that do? No one else will listen, but someone has listened, Verena reminded her, voice calm, resolute. And that's where all change begins. Everleigh felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. A distant memory returned. Tea in a dim parlor with Verena, and her ancient great-aunt, a woman whose cloudy eyes seemed to peer through walls and secrets. She sees more than most would ever suspect, Verena had said that day, and I fear I take after her. Now, that same penetrating perception glittered in Verena's gaze. You're certain it wasn't a dream or some illusion? She asked softly. Everleigh almost laughed. My eyes may not be what they once were, but I'm not prone to imagining strangulations, Jane. I know what I saw. As do I, Verena said firmly. And that makes this all the more chilling. You said the woman wore a fur coat. Yes, Everleigh nodded. But it was open or shoved back. Underneath, something blue. A dress, maybe a suit. I didn't get a clear look. And your train, was it moving? Not at the time, Everleigh said slowly, remembering. Signal delay. That's why I saw so clearly. The other train was crawling past, delayed by the same signal, I suppose. Our windows lined up perfectly. No blinds were drawn in either carriage, so there was light, clarity. Verena's tone sharpened, which means your vision was true. No tricks, no dream. It was real. Everleigh said, her voice steady now. Real and terrible. I saw a man kill a woman, and I don't know where to turn. Verena stood then, moving to the window, the moonlight casting her silhouette in silver against the garden beyond. Then we begin with what we can find, she said. We identify the woman. We search for her body. But how, Jane? We don't even know where she is. Not yet, Verena murmured. But we will. Someone out there believes they've committed the perfect murder. A stranger on a train. No trace. No body. No link except one witness. No one believes. But no crime is perfect, Everly. There are always frayed edges. Loose threads. She turned back, her eyes lit with determination. Tomorrow, we begin our search. It will take time. It will take logic. And more than anything, it will require us to believe in what others refuse to see. Believe in what? Everly asked, voice barely a whisper. In the impossible, Verena said, her needles clicking once more as she resumed her knitting, the quiet rhythm somehow more ominous now. Not for us, of course, but for the police, for the authorities, for anyone who needs a body to believe a murder occurred. And that, she said softly, is where their mistake begins. The following morning unfolded under a cold but deceptively serene sky, the last remnants of the night's rain now glistening like scattered diamonds upon the frost-bitten petals of Miss Lillian Gracewood's garden. Silence stretched across the cottage like a held breath, broken only by the soft clack of knitting needles in Lillian's hands and the faint rustling of the winter wind brushing past her lace-draped windows. As always, she had risen early, not out of habit alone, but driven by a nagging sense that something terrible had stirred just beyond the surface of the ordinary. When Mrs. Aloan Briar entered shortly after 9, wrapped in a wool shawl and a lingering cloud of worry, despite a night of sleep, Lillian already sat poised at her writing desk, eyes distant as though sifting through invisible threads of an unfolding tapestry. Lillian, Aloan began quietly, accepting the steaming cup of tea offered to her. I've been thinking, maybe I should go to Scotland Yard. Perhaps they'd believe me more than the railway officials. Lillian turned, her expression gentle but resolute, and said, without a body, or any hard evidence beyond your fleeting glimpse of something dreadful, they'd dismiss you the same way the conductor did, politely, but firmly. No, Aloan. If we want the truth, we'll have to extract it ourselves, inch by inch. A pause lingered between them, charged with unspoken questions. Then what do we do? Aloan asked, her voice taut with helpless frustration. Lillian's eyes narrowed ever so slightly as her knitting paused mid-stitch. We begin with what we can uncover. First, we must search for any recent reports of missing women whose descriptions might match what you saw. Second, we need to consider the logistics, where a body could be disposed of from a moving train on that particular route. It's not as easy as it sounds. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the frost-patterned window. You know, this reminds me, strangely, and rather disturbingly, of something that happened right here in St. Helens Hollow, some 15 years ago. Do you recall the name Jory Penwright? Aloan frowned, searching her memory. Wasn't he the old groundskeeper? The one who used to sweep leaves outside the chapel? Lillian nodded slowly. Yes, poor Jory had an unfortunate fondness for gin, and for that reason, no one ever took him seriously. But one summer night, he came rushing into the pub, pale as death, claiming he'd seen someone stabbed along the railway embankment. Everyone thought he was drunk or hallucinating. Even the local doctor waved it off as a fit of delirium tremens. But 3 weeks later, a young man's body was found hidden beneath the overgrown root cellar behind Marwick Farm, stabbed clean through the ribs. And the date, the exact night Jory had made his panicked claim. Lillian resumed her knitting, but her words hung heavy in the room. People were less quick to dismiss him after that, though sadly, his drinking didn't stop. Aloan's eyes widened with dawning realization. So you believe me, that I really did see a murder on that train? Lillian looked up sharply, her tone now firm, undeniable. I believe it completely. The question is not if it happened, it's where the body is now, and who she was. Rising from her chair, she moved with quiet purpose to the small writing desk in the corner, where a stack of crisp paper waited. I believe it's time to write to my godson, Inspector Halver Crane. He's with Scotland Yard now, quite accomplished. From time to time, He seeks my perspective on particularly puzzling cases. She dipped her pen into ink with practiced grace. He trusts me. He doesn't dismiss my instincts as mere fancies. Eloan, still gripping her teacup, asked hesitantly, "Do you think he'll believe me, when no one else did?" Lillian's smile was soft, but her eyes held steel. "He will believe me, my dear, and that's all we need." Just then, a gentle knock at the door signaled the arrival of Florence, Lillian's cheerful housekeeper, bundled in a thick scarf, and bearing a wicker basket brimming with provisions. "Good morning, miss," she chirped, stomping the cold from her boots. "Frosty one today, it is. Oh, didn't know Mrs. Briar was visiting. What a lovely surprise." But the two women inside barely responded, already bound by a silent vow, a pact not just to uncover a hidden murder, but to bring to light the invisible threads of darkness no one else could see. Somewhere out there, a lifeless woman lay discarded, her story buried beneath the clatter of passing wheels and official indifference. But Lillian Gracewood would not let it remain buried for long. The mystery had only just begun, and the dead, as she knew too well, had a habit of speaking when one knew how to listen. "Well now, Miss Gracewood," chirped Florence, as she set down her heavy wicker basket with a soft thump against the polished wood floor, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with a flour-dusted hand. "There's quite the stir in the village this morning. Bit of news that set tongues wagging like church bells on Sunday." Lillian Gracewood, who had been meticulously polishing the edge of her brass lamp in the window seat, looked up slowly, her eyes narrowing not out of age, but instinct. "Oh, something more than the vicar's new sermon, or young Beatrice eloping again?" she asked dryly. Florence leaned closer, lowering her voice as though the very walls might whisper back. "Someone's moved into Cromere House. Late at night too. No fuss, just a car, all black and sleek like a hearse, and one big trunk. People say it's a woman, Miss Alara Venn. Supposedly she's connected to the old Varley family somehow, maybe a niece or a cousin, but no one's really sure." "You remember Alden Varley, don't you? Threw himself from the turret after that business with the ledger and the boy in the well." The name struck something deep in Lillian's memory, a faint ache behind the eyes. Cromere, that vast decaying mansion crouched on the edge of the moor like a wounded animal, stone gargoyles weeping moss, its windows long blind to light. And the railway track, yes, she remembered. It curved beneath its western grounds just beyond the embankment, where the mist always clung low, and the crows never left. "Interesting," she said softly, almost to herself. "Very interesting." As Florence rattled on about how the place gave her the creeps, with its rattling windows and howls that could never quite be explained by the wind, Lillian rose and walked to her bookshelf, drawing out a folded Ordnance Survey map and spreading it across the table. "The 446 from Aldwych to Wexham slows at this precise curve," she murmured, tracing the line with a gloved fingertip. "Held at signal post 11. And the Wexham Express from the other direction would pass just here." Her voice dropped. "That's where Eloan said she saw the body. Between trains. Between moments. The perfect vanishing point." Just then the door creaked, and in stepped Mrs. Eloan Briar, still pale from her haunting experience aboard the train. She held a folded newspaper beneath her arm, but hadn't turned a single page. "Any progress?" she asked. Lillian looked up, her expression unreadable. "Cromere may hold answers. Miss Venn's arrival seems timed." Eloan hesitated. "You think she's involved? Or knows something?" Lillian replied. "That house has stood empty for 2 decades. Yet she comes now quietly, with no past and no explanation." She lifted an envelope from the table, already sealed and addressed to Inspector Halver Crane. "The police will do what they can, but a hunch isn't a crime, and a ghost isn't evidence. We'll need to look where they won't." Eloan swallowed. "And what do you want me to do?" "Visit the station master," said Lillian. "Ask about the logs from Tuesday. If your train was held at signal 11, it may have crossed with the Wexham Express. 2 carriages, 2 perspectives, 1 disappearance." She turned to the window, watching the low fog begin to roll in from the eastern ridge. "As for me, I'll be calling on Reverend Ashton. His sister Margaret knows every shoe that treads this village, and I suspect she'll have heard something, perhaps more than she should. Later that afternoon, as Lillian made her way along the frost-slick lane, her breath clouding in the crisp winter air, her thoughts returned to Cromere's legacy, its many whispered tragedies, its locked rooms, and that curious clause in Alden Varley's will forbidding its sale for 20 years. Something had been buried, not just within its foundations, but in memory itself. At the gate of the vicarage she paused. A car sat idling just beyond the hedge, sleek and foreign, a model too fine for this quiet parish, its windows dark and unreadable. She noted the plate, but didn't linger. Secrets had a way of arriving before their names were known, and in St. Braith's Hollow, time moved slowly, but shadows moved faster. Somewhere beneath the stillness, beneath the creak of trees, and the distant wail of a late train, a story was beginning to stir, one that had never truly ended. Not then. Not yet. When Miss Ada Hargrave received an invitation regarding the newly reformed Charity Relief Committee, hosted quite intriguingly at the long-abandoned Rothfern Manor, she felt a familiar thrill crawl up her spine, the kind that only came when secrets waited just beneath the surface. "Odd, isn't it?" she remarked to her close friend, Mrs. Edwina Blythe, who was accompanying her as both moral support and fellow sleuth. "No one knows who Logan Vale really is, and yet here he is, residing in a place that has remained locked and silent for nearly 2 decades. That grey afternoon, the two women strolled up the overgrown drive, crunching dead leaves underfoot, as they passed rusted gates and crumbling statues, the manor looming ahead like a watching sentinel, battered by time, yet not entirely asleep. The ivy clung too tightly to the stone, almost as though it were trying to smother the building, or hide something within. "Notice that vine," Ada whispered. "It's been trimmed, but poorly. Someone's trying to make this place look presentable, but not lived in." The heavy front door creaked open to reveal a woman in her 50s, with a tired yet perceptive face and eyes that didn't quite match the warmth in her voice. "Miss Hargrave. Mrs. Blythe. I'm Eleanora Vale, Logan's younger sister," she said with mechanical politeness, but Ada sensed something rehearsed in her tone, something that didn't quite ring true. Inside, the manor was dim, dust-ridden and cavernous. The drawing-room still bore the scent of extinguished fire and closed windows. As the rest of the committee members arrived, cheerful women blissfully unaware of the cold undercurrents, Ada scanned every surface, faded portraits with painted eyes that seemed too focused, a grandfather clock that hadn't ticked in years, and a strange oil painting above the mantel where a shadowed man appeared to press his hand over something invisible. When Ada inquired casually about the manor's history, Eleanora only smiled thinly and answered, "It belonged to our uncle, Percival Vale. But there's no record of him now. He left." Her pause held weight. During tea, Ada noticed framed letters lining the corridor walls, some in Latin, some in archaic German, and one in a script she didn't recognize at all. When the meeting concluded, and Eleanora offered to give the ladies a tour of the ground floor, Ada followed closely. In the library, a particular shelf stood unusually deep, casting uneven shadows, as if the wall behind it weren't really a wall at all. "That section's off limits," Eleanora interrupted sharply as Ada approached. "Logan insists privacy matters." They moved through the pantry, kitchen, and a long-forgotten morning room, and as they re-entered the hallway, Ada glanced at an antique mirror. Her own reflection was oddly distorted, but another fainter silhouette lingered just behind her shoulder, watching from inside the glass. As the women prepared to leave, Ada leaned in slightly and asked softly, "Why was this house sealed for so long?" Eleanora responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some places don't wait for time. They wait for return." Outside, as the fog began to settle over the landscape, Ada turned once more toward the manor's towering roof, and saw, just for a second, a curtain twitch. "Logan Vale?" Edwina asked nervously. Ada didn't answer immediately. Her gaze hardened. "Or someone who never left at all." As Miss Aldora Gray stepped quietly into the entrance hall of Briarstone Hollow, she paused near a narrow window that overlooked the sprawling rear gardens, her gaze drawn not to the neatly trimmed hedges, but to the faint shimmer of metal far beyond. "What a peculiar view," she remarked softly, her tone laced with innocent curiosity. "Is that the railway line so close to the estate?" For a fleeting second, a strange shadow passed over Lady Evelyn Stroud's face, almost as though the mention of the tracks had stirred something long buried. "Yes," she replied, with a brittle smile. "Far too close, I'd say. The sound, it disrupts the calm sometimes. I suppose one learns to ignore it," mused Miss Gray, still watching the tracks disappear behind a line of skeletal trees. "Was it always there?" "No," Evelyn said tightly. "It came after. My grandfather opposed it, fought the council, threatened litigation, even wrote to Parliament. But they called it progress. He called it desecration." Her voice trembled for a moment, then steadied. "The settlement was generous, I suppose, but he never forgave them." As the other ladies began donning their gloves and preparing to leave, Aldora lingered behind, her eyes catching something through a narrow side pane, an ancient stone shape, half sunken in the garden's mossy earth. "How unusual," she said, tilting her head. "Is that a sarcophagus?" Lady Evelyn followed her gaze, her composure faltering again. "Yes. Another of my grandfather's fascinations. Roman, I think, brought back from Sicily. If I remember rightly. Ugly thing. Too heavy to remove, so it just stayed." Aldora's interest sharpened. "Fascinating. Rather an odd centerpiece for a garden." On their walk back toward the village, Mrs. Elspeth Carruthers leaned in. "Well? Did anything strike you?" Aldora's fingers tightened subtly on her handbag. "Yes, but I can't quite say what. When I mentioned the railway," Lady Evelyn's expression changed. She seemed almost afraid. "I noticed," said Elspeth. She went pale as bone china. "And that sarcophagus," Aldora added slowly. "Something about it didn't feel right. It's not just decorative. It's too old, too solid. You know, Elspeth, you once said that when you saw the woman on the train, before she was strangled, you noticed she was wearing blue under her coat." "Yes." Elspeth nodded, her brow furrowing. "A blue dress, and the man, he had his back turned. I couldn't see his face, only that he was broad-shouldered, in a long dark coat." Aldora's eyes narrowed, as her mind stitched threads together. "Then we'll go tomorrow, to where the line passes close to the hollow. There's a public footpath, if I'm not mistaken. If someone needed to dispose of a body discreetly and quickly, they might use their own land to do it." "You think the body could be hidden on the estate?" Elspeth whispered, a chill passing between them. "Possibly," Aldora answered, "though not in the obvious places." As the rooftops of Briarstone Hollow disappeared behind them, Aldora suddenly halted mid-step. "I've just remembered, in the case of that solicitor, James Abernathy, the body was found days later inside an ornamental well. Only the gardener's terrier sniffed it out." She trailed off, deep in thought. Her mind returned to that sarcophagus. Ancient, unmovable, hollow. "Elspeth," she said quietly, "when you return to London, I'd like you to visit the antiquities wing of the Royal Museum. See what you can learn about Roman burial stonework, especially their lids and how they seal." "You think the body?" Elspeth didn't finish the question. "I think we've missed something hiding in plain sight," Aldora said grimly. And as she stood at the gate to her cottage, her eyes turned once more to the dusky silhouette of Briarstone Hollow, just a dark smudge against the setting winter sun. Somewhere beneath those sloping gables and frost-kissed gardens, Aldora Gray felt it in her bones. The truth was buried, and not metaphorically. And she intended to unearth it, stone by stone, lie by lie. For Miss Eliza Weatherby, the morning appeared perfectly ordinary. Sunlight spilled softly across the breakfast table, catching on the silver cutlery, and dancing over the surface of her teacup. But the moment she lifted the morning newspaper, A small headline sent a chill racing down her spine. Margot Dubois, French lady's maid, missing after boarding the 4:50 Paddington Express. Last seen 3 nights ago. Her fingers gripped the edge of the paper, but the teacup trembled slightly, and never quite reached her lips. Margot Dubois, the same French maid who worked for Countess Evangeline Morland, who had recently mentioned visiting a friend in Bramhurst, and then vanished into thin air. Eliza's eyes fell, her mind reaching for fragments of memory. An unlit train compartment, a terrified face, a muffled scream, a hand tightening around a throat, and then darkness. Across from her, Colonel James Ainsley was quietly spreading marmalade over toast, but his eyes held the same quiet terror Eliza had seen in that woman's eyes on the train. "Colonel," she said softly. "It was the same train I was on. I saw that woman. Someone was strangling her." His hand froze mid-motion, as though his nerves had been stripped bare. "You're saying that woman was Margot? Blue dress, dark coat, trembling eyes." Eliza whispered. "I can't forget it." The colonel folded the newspaper, and silently slipped the clipping into his pocket. A name echoed in Eliza's mind. Eleanor Hargrove, the village historian, fascinated by manor houses, and the secrets buried within them. When Eliza visited her, Eleanor retrieved an envelope Margot had left the very week she took her mysterious leave. Inside were brittle old letters, a yellowed map, and a hastily scribbled note. "Beneath the garden lies what should have never been uncovered." Eleanor explained that the Countess had ties to Ashton Grange, a sealed manor house said to harbor unsettling legends of people being buried alive beneath its stone foundations. The revelation rattled Eliza's soul, and when she heard that Tom Lewis, the manor's longtime gardener, had suddenly resigned, her suspicion deepened. 3 whiskeys deep at the local pub, he had shouted. It was moving again. I saw it. It was breathing beneath the earth. That night, Eliza dragged the reluctant colonel to the overgrown garden behind Ashton Grange, to the very spot marked on the old map as the forgotten tomb. In the moonlight, the earth looked disturbed, and old flower petals still lay fresh near a rectangular stone slab. The colonel tried to stop her, but Eliza, driven by instinct, began to dig. The first scrape revealed blue silk, gleaming in the moonlight, unmistakably part of Margot's dress. The second stroke uncovered a pale hand, dry, contorted, and frozen, as though trying to speak in its final moments. The colonel placed a cold, lifeless hand on her shoulder. "We have to leave," he whispered. But Eliza, in that moment, understood. Margot had not been the victim of some tragic accident. She had known something the Countess wasn't the only one trying to hide. "You knew, didn't you, Colonel? You were there that night," Eliza said, her voice icy. A faint smile flickered across his lips, a smile that was both an admission and a warning. "This is only the beginning, Eliza," he said. "Margot was the first. What was buried alive beneath the soil is waking again." And in that moment, Eliza realized what she had witnessed on the train wasn't just a murder. It was a ritual, a summoning, a dark secret that pulsed between earth, blood, and lineage. That night, Eliza wasn't merely a witness. She had just become the next target. It was a morning cloaked in a silence thick with unease. As Clara Elwood stepped out of her house, her coat catching the wind like a warning flutter in a storm. Her hands were cold, but her mind burned with the heat of the anonymous letter she'd received just an hour earlier. Words inked with threat, subtle yet cruel. "You've seen too much. Stay silent, or the garden will bloom red again." Each line gnawed at her nerves, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. She hadn't told anyone, not even Father Mallory, who always seemed to sense when shadows began to stir beneath the calm of their sleepy village. That morning, Clara had been summoned to Elderstone Hall, allegedly to assess a collection of rare botanical manuscripts. But the moment she crossed its threshold, the ancient oak door creaking like a groan of protest, she knew this invitation was never about books. It was about secrets. Lady Rowena, pale and withdrawn, greeted her with a hesitant nod, But Clara noticed how her eyes kept drifting toward the parlor, toward an armchair turned away from the fireplace, as if someone invisible was listening. "We found this," Rowena whispered, holding out a crumpled blue ribbon, still faintly scented with lavender. Clara's heart froze. It belonged to Elise Marceau, the brilliant French botanist, who had vanished without a trace 6 weeks ago, just days after she confided in Clara about strange undocumented plants she'd discovered in the greenhouse. Elise had spoken of them in hushed tones, terrified. She'd mentioned a journal, written in coded entries, and a place that remembers what was buried, and now it's waking up. Clara had dismissed it at the time as overwork, but now, standing in the house where Elise was last seen, that fear returned like frost crawling up her spine. Rowena confessed there had been disturbances at the greenhouse, no break-ins, nothing stolen, just the sense that something had been fed. Clara left in a daze, and made her way to the vicarage, where Reverend Mallory, ever watchful, shared the manor's grim past, families broken by war, a hidden chapel beneath the cellar, a child who fell into the old well, and was never found. Each story felt like a thread, tangling around Clara's thoughts, forming the start of a tapestry she hadn't yet dared to envision. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the greenhouse bathed in moonlight. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement, a shape where no shape should be. She slipped outside, silent as breath, and followed the shadows to the overgrown garden. There, near an ivy-choked well, the soil had been disturbed. She knelt and brushed away the earth, revealing a book's leather edge, Elise's journal. Inside were sketches of plants never seen in any record, passages scribbled in panicked French, and one name underlined again and again, Rowena. Before Clara could read more, a voice behind her cut through the night, soft but laced with menace. "You should have burned that when you had the chance." She turned slowly. A silhouette stood behind her, moonlight gleaming off a broken garden trowel, clutched like a dagger. In those eyes Clara saw no hesitation, only history. Elise hadn't been the first, and Clara wouldn't be the last. Beneath Elderstone Hall, something still breathed, roots of secrets buried too deep, watered by blood and silence, now clawing back into the light. Clara Elwood, once a quiet botanist, now found herself entangled in a garden of lies, and her name too would be written not in ink, but in soil, in shadow, and in the scent of dying lavender. It began on a morning, wrapped in the kind of mist that clings to rooftops and blurs the edges of memory. A day that should have passed unnoticed in the sleepy time-forgotten village of Dunsfield, where the only sounds were birdsong, and the occasional whistle of an empty freight train, winding through the overgrown tracks behind the hills. But something was shifting. Miss Evelyn Harrow, a retired archivist, known for her reclusive habits and unparalleled recall of obscure village history, found an envelope on her doorstep, unmarked, yellowed with damp, and sealed with a strange wax symbol, resembling a coiled serpent. Inside was a single line scrawled in uneven ink. "You saw more than you should have." She froze. The handwriting stirred something half-remembered in her, a buried moment from decades ago, when she was just a girl, and witnessed a figure standing motionless at the abandoned station platform long after the last train had supposedly passed. That same morning, the village awoke to the news that Gregory Fenn, a brilliant yet solitary historian obsessed with local railway folklore, had vanished without a trace. His study was left untouched, kettle whistling, fire low, notes scattered across his desk with phrases underlined in red, "The passenger that never left," "Manifest incomplete," and "Witness unaccounted." The authorities dismissed it as eccentricity turned tragic, but Evelyn felt the warning signs sharpening like needles in her skin. She called on her old friend Clara Baines, a sharp-witted linguist with a passion for cryptic symbols and forgotten languages, and together they began to trace a pattern through the silence. In a faded ledger deep within Dunsfield's archives, they uncovered mention of a train that had arrived on a stormy night in 1911, recorded only once and never again, no passengers disembarked, no destination listed, no return journey marked. Whispers followed their every step as they dug deeper. An unscheduled midnight whistle heard by farmers, children speaking of people in old clothes, walking by the tracks, luggage that appeared in locked waiting rooms, with no names and no origin. All paths led to a long dead name, whispered in fragments. Marguerite Aveline, a French governess employed at Rutherford House, who disappeared the same year the train arrived, and whose portrait still hung in the drawing room, wearing a distinctive cobalt blue coat. What chilled Evelyn most was when Clara, passing through the village square at dusk, saw a woman in that same coat board a train that no one else seemed to see. They followed this phantom trail to the crumbling ruins of the old station master's house, where vines strangled the roof and soot still clung to the hearth, as though someone had left only moments before. On the mantel, they found Gregory Fenn's pocket watch, ticking steadily at the same minute he was last seen. Nearby, half-burned papers revealed a list of names, people thought dead, people who had vanished without explanation, each one last spotted near the tracks. Then came the knock, a hollow sound that reverberated through the silent ruins. Evelyn approached the door, heart pounding like thunder beneath her ribs, and heard a voice murmur from the fog, "Miss Harrow, it's your turn now." Through the grimy window she saw it, a train gliding past in impossible silence, its lights flickering as if underwater, shadows seated within, motionless, faces barely formed. The wind carried the scent of old smoke, and something floral, lilacs, faint but unmistakable. On the muddy ground outside were footprints, fresh, leading toward the tracks, too large to be hers, too recent to be from anyone else. Clara begged her not to follow, but Evelyn understood. This wasn't about one disappearance. It was an inheritance, a curse passed through generations, a spectral cycle fed by silence, memory, and forgotten names. The villagers had stopped speaking of the train because it only took those who remembered. She realized then that Marguerite Aveline had never left, not truly. She was waiting, and unless Evelyn uncovered the truth behind that cursed manifest, the one name that was deliberately left off the ledger, she too would soon vanish between stations, her footsteps lost in the mist, her voice another echo in the night. Each time the whistle sounded, calling the next to board, the morning air clung with a biting chill, seeping through coat seams and nestling into the very bones, as the brittle frost painted the hedgerows in delicate white lace, and the sun, hidden behind a morning veil of grey clouds, cast no warmth upon the earth. Yet Miss Adelaide Thornwood, resolute in her step and with eyes that had dissected more lies than most could tell, walked steadily down the damp cobbled lane beside her companion, Mrs. Eliza Penmore, a genteel widow known both for her razor-sharp memory and her unfortunate habit of fainting at the slightest provocation of blood or scandal. Their destination was the imposing and shadow-drenched estate of Elderbrook Grange, a house older than most family secrets, its ancient stone facade smothered in ivy and rumor alike, the sort of place where history didn't just linger, it watched. Of late, Elderbrook had become the epicenter of murmured gossip and town-wide speculation after the sudden and curious death of Lionel Hale, the family patriarch, whose demise had officially been ruled heart failure, though the undertaker's whispered comment about the expression frozen on his face, a look of shock, fear, and something worse had never left Adelaide's mind. Their route to the estate wound deliberately past the moss-choked viaduct, long disused but not forgotten, a place now swallowed by nature, but once the scene of a tragedy that made national headlines. A train derailed under bizarre and unexplained conditions, with all passengers lost save for one, a silent, wide-eyed boy, who never spoke again. Adelaide remembered the photographs, the shattered carriage, the eerie stillness, and the boy's face, hollow and unreadable. It had always felt unfinished, unresolved. The air grew colder as they approached Elderbrook, and even the birds seemed to fall silent beneath the looming chimneys. From within the house, voices rose and overlapped in tense discord, only to abruptly fall silent the moment the massive oak door creaked open, revealing the stern silhouette of the butler, who blinked as if startled to find the world still turning. "You're just in time," said Lady Corvina Hale, stepping into view like a spectre from a portrait. Her voice brittle, her smile drawn so tightly it seemed in danger of cracking. "The others are already inside." She led them through dim corridors lined with ancestral oil paintings, many of whom seemed to gaze down in judgment or warning, until they reached the drawing room, where 3 men stood as though summoned by fate rather than invitation. Jonas Hale, the late Lionel's eldest son, tall and steeled with the kind of composure that cloaked darker things, a man whose quietness was less peace and more control. Malcolm, the awkward middle brother, younger and visibly frayed, his fingers stained with ink and twitching against his trousers, and finally Rupert, the cousin, the enigma, whose olive complexion, paint-streaked cuffs, and distant eyes suggested long days spent in Italian light and longer nights, pondering things too strange to name. As they passed the guests, Eliza's posture subtly changed, her spine rigid, her lips parted in unspoken recognition, especially when Rupert's left hand brushed too close. She didn't speak, but her tremble did. Adelaide, ever the hawk, missed none of it. The supposed meeting unfolded under the pretense of charity, a local benefit for orphaned children, or some other suitably noble cause. But Adelaide's attention wandered far from budgets and volunteer rosters. She watched Lady Corvina, noting the cracks in her performance, the way her hand trembled when pouring tea, the way she avoided looking out the far window which faced the tangled ravine beyond the property, and the way her breath caught whenever Jonas cleared his throat. There was tension in the walls, old and thick. As the others rose to leave, Adelaide remained behind, her gloved fingers drifting to the edge of the curtain, as she stared at the far corner of the garden, where a stone mausoleum crouched like a secret. "That's quite an imposing feature," she said aloud, not turning. "Unusual choice for a garden ornament." Corvina's voice came fast, too fast. "It was here before the house. My grandfather built around it. Some say it marks the site of the old railway line before it was rerouted after the accident." She hesitated. Nothing more than a relic now. But Adelaide's gaze lingered, not on the stone, but on the gleam of new bolts embedded in ancient rock, the faint scuff marks at the base, as though something or someone had been moved. They stepped outside at dusk, the sky now drained of light, when a sudden scream cleaved through the stillness like a knife, sharp and immediate. Without waiting, Adelaide took off toward the source, Eliza close behind despite her better judgment, both of them reaching the overgrown east wing just as a cluster of household staff and family surged toward the same spot. An elderly gardener, his hands shaking and face pale, pointed toward the bramble-thick passage leading to the greenhouse ruins. "I saw her," he insisted, his voice shaking. "Clear as daylight. A woman in a blue coat. She was standing there, looking at me, and then, she vanished." Rupert chuckled too loudly. Malcolm muttered about light and shadow. Jonas's jaw clenched, but Adelaide saw the truth ripple beneath the denials. That night, with Elderbrook Grange fading behind them, and the night wind whispering through the hedgerows, Eliza's voice came low and tight with dread. "That coat. It's the same one. The one the woman on the train wore." Her voice trembled. "The one I saw murdered all those years ago." Adelaide stopped in her tracks, the breath stolen from her lungs, her eyes drawn once again to the forgotten viaduct in the distance. Something was coming full circle. Not a ghost story, not quite, but something unfinished, unresolved, and buried deeper than the roots of Elderbrook. For Adelaide now knew the train hadn't derailed by accident, and whoever stood in that blue coat had returned not to haunt but to warn, and perhaps to reveal. The wind whispered through the thorny hedgerows, as Miss Adelaide Thornwood stood at the edge of the overgrown cemetery bordering Blackmere Hall, her gloved fingers brushing the frost-bitten iron gate as if trying to summon a forgotten memory. It was nearly dusk, and the sky had turned the color of old bruises, casting a morose light across the moss-laden statues and crumbling gravestones that tilted like drunken sentinels. At her side, Reverend Halbert adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat nervously, already regretting agreeing to accompany her. "Do you really believe the answers lie here?" he asked, his breath clouding the air. "No," Adelaide murmured, her eyes locked on the crooked crypt at the far end, its stone door inexplicably ajar. But I believe someone wants us to look here instead of where the truth actually sleeps. Just last night, an envelope had been slipped beneath her door. No return address, no handwriting, just a single sheet inside, bearing a hand-drawn map smeared with reddish ink, marked with an X over the graveyard and the words beneath, "Not behind." The Vale remembers. The same night, Mrs. Cresswell, the housekeeper at Blackmere Hall, had vanished without a trace, leaving only a cracked teacup, a single blue button, and the smell of scorched lavender in her quarters, as if someone, or something had tried to burn time itself. Within the hall's ivy-strangled walls, the air had changed too. Lady Honoria Blackmere had been seen pacing barefoot in the library at midnight, muttering fractured lullabies to a mirror that no longer reflected her face. Her nephew, the young and reclusive Mr. Linwood, had been caught burning pages from an 18th century diary in the drawing-room fireplace, eyes wild, lips moving soundlessly. When questioned, he merely whispered, "Some memories shouldn't be remembered." Adelaide had spent the morning quietly observing, letting silence speak where words were lies. She saw how Linwood's hands flinched whenever the grandfather clock struck, how Lady Honoria flinched when the West Wing piano played itself just before dawn. But it was here, in the decaying cemetery behind the hall, where Adelaide felt the pulse of the mystery tighten around her like ivy. The crypt's open door wasn't an accident, it was bait. Inside, her lantern cast trembling light on the cold damp stone as they descended. The air felt wrong, not simply cold, but hollow, stripped of time. Beneath a false slab, they uncovered a hidden cavity not filled with bones, but with relics, rusted chains, scorched playing cards, faded photographs with the faces scratched out, and at the center, a small wooden box that seemed to hum faintly in her palms. She opened it carefully. Inside was a blood-stained veil, wrapped around a medallion engraved with the sigil of the Obscura Society, a long-buried organization said to conduct psychic experiments through scent, lullabies and silence. Adelaide's breath caught. She'd read of them in suppressed court records. Their last known project involved erasing entire identities through sound frequencies encoded into train whistles. Outside, the wind shifted, and then, distant but clear, came the ghostly wail of a train whistle. Reverend Halbert froze. "That can't be," he whispered. "That line's been closed since the Ashcroft tragedy. 37 years ago to the day." Adelaide closed the box slowly, staring up at the swirling mist now curling through the broken stained glass above. The Ashcroft train had vanished between stations. No wreckage, no bodies. Just a single child found in a field, humming a tune no one recognized. "It's not a haunting," she said softly. "It's a pattern." As they stepped outside, the train whistle sounded again, closer this time, as if circling something long buried. She turned her eyes toward the jagged silhouette of Blackmere Hall. "The Vale didn't forget," she murmured. "It waited, and now, it remembers everything." Thick with an unnatural stillness, the morning mist curled over the frost-kissed grounds of Wetherby Grange like a shroud, muffling every sound save the crunch of Inspector Harlan Gray's boots on gravel as he stepped past the iron-wrought gates and into a garden that felt long forgotten by time. The estate loomed before him, its ivy-strangled walls, shuttered windows, and age-warped chimneys, seeming less like architecture and more like relics of something buried in shame. Beside the skeletal fountain, where algae clung to dry stone, Miss Evelyn Hartmore stood waiting, her gloved hands clasped tightly as her eyes, as precise as a hawk's, followed the slow movements of officers combing through the tangled hedges. "This place breathes lies," she murmured, her voice barely more than breath, "and every stone knows what the people here refuse to say." Just then, a call rang out from beneath a cluster of hawthorn trees. An officer knelt, holding a blood-stained scarf, its deep burgundy fabric soaked through and heavy, like it had been waiting to be found. Gray examined it grimly, nodded once, and ordered the perimeter widened. "We're getting close. Secrets don't stay buried forever." Moments later, a figure emerged hurriedly from the glasshouse. Lillian Vexley, the poised and pale fiancée of the Granger's heir, her expression tight, eyes wide. "Inspector, there's something in the east stables, a cellar beneath the feed-room. I've never seen it before, but someone sealed it shut. And the horses, they've been restless ever since." Gray's gaze sharpened. "Take me." Miss Hartmore, uninvited but welcome in her own silent authority, fell into step beside him, as they crossed the overgrown courtyard, and reached the warped wooden structure where dust danced in sunbeams and silence pressed in like a physical force. The cellar door was nailed down with fresh iron spikes over rotting wood. Within moments, officers pried it open with metal tools and strained breaths, the sound of splintering wood reverberating like cannon fire in the stillness. A suffocating wave of chilled, moldy air wafted out, and with it the unmistakable stench of death. Lanterns flickered as they descended. There, half buried beneath torn sheeting and broken crates, lay the body, wrapped in a red velvet curtain, her face drawn tight in death, yet eerily familiar, even beneath the pallor and bruising. Gray didn't speak. He didn't need to. Miss Hartmore whispered, her breath catching. "I saw her 3 weeks ago, on the train from Granley. She was terrified, clutching something. A small music box. I remember the tune. It was strange, discordant, like a lullaby played backwards. Then, a man followed her into the next car. She never came back." Gray's jaw clenched. That train derailed that very night. 3 passengers unaccounted for. Lillian, now visibly shaken, stepped closer to the dim light. "Her name was Alina Greaves," she whispered. "She came here before the crash, asking for Dominic. She said they were siblings. She said they were separated after the fire at Merrow Asylum. Dominic refused to see her, said she was a liar. But she knew things no stranger could have known." Gray turned slowly. "And what did you do, Miss Vexley?" Her voice trembled. "I begged her to leave. I offered her money. I was afraid." Dominic had changed since her visit. He was paranoid, violent in his sleep. "I didn't connect it until now." Miss Hartmore's eyes had drifted out past the barn, toward the edge of the trees where the old railway line sliced across the horizon like a scar. "This place, these people, they've built their legacy on buried truths. But the dead always leave breadcrumbs." That evening, as wind clawed at the shutters and firelight danced across the walls of Miss Hartmore's study, a courier arrived with forensic reports. Alina's fingerprints matched the ones found inside the music box, recovered weeks earlier from the train wreckage. But beneath its false bottom, hidden with the precision of someone desperate to be heard, was a photograph. 4 children in hospital gowns, standing before the burned husk of Merrow Psychiatric Institute. One of them, unmistakably, was Dominic Weatherby. "She wasn't delusional," Gray said quietly. "She came with truth in her hands, and someone buried it, piece by piece, with her." And as thunder cracked above the moors, a new question chilled them all. If the music box survived the crash intact, who had returned it to the ruins just days after Alina's death? A heavy oppressive silence hung in the air as Inspector Zubair revealed the grim truth behind the decaying Hawthorne mansion. A lifeless body, discovered in the icy silence of an old freezer. The identity confirmed, Omar Fareed. But the question that loomed large was, if the killer truly intended to hide the body, why keep it on the property itself, so dangerously close? Miss Sakina, whose sharp intellect had often untangled the most intricate of mysteries, remained unusually quiet. Her mind echoed with Emma's words. How Omar had arrived seeking someone, claiming it was a family matter. Simultaneously, her thoughts flashed to the chilling anonymous note received by Lucy Merrin. "Justice is coming by rail." The next morning, official confirmation came that the body in the freezer was indeed Omar Fareed, and the cause of death, strangulation. But when Inspector Zubair visited Miss Sakina to discuss the medical examiner's findings, he revealed a twist. The estimated time of death was only 10 to 15 days ago. Miss Sakina's mind seized on that detail immediately. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Bano had witnessed a murder while traveling by train. So how could Omar have been killed later? Had the man she witnessed being strangled not been Omar after all? I can't be wrong, Sakina, Mrs. Bano insisted from the edge of the window seat, her voice trembling yet firm. I know what I saw, and I believe you, Miss Sakina replied gently but resolutely. Which means, she added, knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm, we're missing something critical. Inspector Zubair had also been investigating the alibis of the Farid family members. Haroun, the eldest son, had been in London, with his secretary and business associates confirming his presence. Azim, the second son, claimed he had been in Birmingham, yet no one had come forward to verify it. Salma, the quiet youngest daughter, had been at the mansion, her presence attested by several village locals, and the patriarch, elderly Rafi Farid, was reportedly bedridden, seen only by his nurse and the family doctor. After the inspector departed, Miss Sakina sat silently by the hearth, her eyes thoughtful, her mind restless. The trains, she murmured, almost to herself. I need to understand the trains. Trains, Mrs. Bano asked, puzzled. Yes, Sakina said, leaning forward slightly. On the day you witnessed the murder, you were on the 4:50 train from Paddington. That train, according to the railway records, had paused at a signal just near the Rutherford curve. You said the murder happened during that moment, when another train ran parallel to yours in the opposite direction. The next morning, the two women arrived at St. Mary Station. The aging station master, Mr. Latif, greeted them warmly, clearly familiar with Miss Sakina's reputation. Darrain schedules? He asked, brows lifting. Now that's a niche request. He led them into his cramped, dusty office, and pulled out a heavy railway timetable book. The 4:50 from Paddington arrives here at 5:38. On the day in question, yes, it was held at the Rutherford curve signal for around 4 minutes, and during those 4 minutes, Sakina inquired, what train passed by in the opposite direction? Mr. Latif traced his fingers across the grid of time entries. That would be the express from Brampton to London, scheduled to pass the curve at exactly 5:28. It doesn't stop at this station. If both trains crossed at that curve, Sakina said slowly, then they would have been right next to each other, close enough for a passenger to clearly see into the opposite compartments. Exactly right, Mr. Latif confirmed. Miss Sakina's eyes lit up, just as Mrs. Bano described. But the contradiction was undeniable. If Omar died days after that train ride, then who had been murdered that day? Or more disturbingly, had anyone truly been murdered at all, or had it all been a performance, a calculated deception timed down to the second? Was it possible someone had staged the scene of the murder, knowing precisely when and where the two trains would intersect, using time, motion, and a witness's eyes to carry out a masterstroke of misdirection? The illusion had worked flawlessly, perhaps too flawlessly. Somewhere within the crumbling walls of Hawthorne Mansion, shadows still shifted, secrets breathed between the floorboards, and whispers clung to the icy silence like frost. Miss Sakina knew now that this case wasn't just about murder, it was about a narrative carefully constructed, a performance rehearsed in silence, and an illusion so precise that even truth had begun to doubt itself. And to reach the heart of it, she would need to go deeper than ever before, into time, memory, and the architecture of lies. The chilling silence of the Hawthorne Mansion was shattered. The morning Omar Farid's lifeless body was discovered, hidden inside the estate's long-forgotten ice chamber, his eyes wide open in frozen horror, lips twisted as if caught mid-plea. Inspector Zubair stood grim, his breath fogging in the bitter cold of the sealed room, while Miss Sakina silently traced the edges of the scene in her mind, noting not just what was there, but what was missing. If someone had truly wanted to hide the body, why leave it in the mansion itself, almost as if daring someone to find it? That question echoed in her thoughts like a haunting refrain. The answer, she suspected, was buried in the shadows of something older, something personal. Omar's sister Emma had quietly confessed days earlier that he had returned to the mansion under mysterious circumstances, muttering about unfinished family business, and a meeting that might set things right. Meanwhile, far away in the village chapel, Lucy Maron had received a cryptic note tucked beneath a church pew, a jagged scrap of parchment, bearing only 4 unsettling words: "Justice will arrive by rail." The next day brought more unsettling clarity. The coroner revealed Omar had died from strangulation, likely 10 to 12 days prior, a timeline that didn't match the scene Mrs. Banno had described just weeks earlier on the 4:50 train from Paddington. She swore she saw a man being murdered, his throat crushed by a figure cloaked in rage, but that incident would have taken place on December 20th. If Omar died days later, then who had she seen, or was her memory manipulated, twisted by the killer to provide a false timeline? "I know what I saw," she repeated, eyes brimming with conviction. Sakina leaned in gently, replying softly, "And that's what worries me. Someone wanted you to see it." The motive was no longer just murder, it was illusion, misdirection. Inspector Zubair had begun background checks on every member of the Farid household. Haroun claimed to be out of town on business, his receipts oddly incomplete. Azim gave vague details about a trip to Birmingham, but had no one to vouch for him. Salma was said to have been inside the mansion all week, never seen outside by staff or neighbor, and old Rafi Farid, bedridden and speechless for years, hadn't left his private quarters in months. But this family was riddled with secrets, and Sakina knew secrets had a way of surfacing at the worst time. She requested train schedules, and studied them with a scholar's intensity. On the day of the alleged train murder, the 4:50 Paddington train had paused unexpectedly near the Rutherford curve, delayed exactly 4 minutes at a faulty signal. In that window, a London-bound express passed by on a parallel track. The description matched Mrs. Banno's account precisely. But there was more. They visited the local library, where Mr. George Wetherell, a retired railway engineer, confirmed something few would know. That stretch of track, if 2 trains align perfectly, even for just seconds, their carriages are so close that, if windows were open, one could theoretically move from one to the other. Suicidal? Yes. Impossible? No. That changed everything. What if the murder wasn't simply committed on a train, but between trains? A body transferred, a witness deceived, and a timeline twisted beyond recognition. Before Sakina could share her latest theory with Zubair, another death struck. Dr. Rafiq, the family physician, was found slumped at his desk in his surgery, a glass vial nearby, unmistakably cyanide. In his final moments, he managed to scrawl a trembling note: "Wrong woman, check December 20th. The words sliced through Sakina, like a cold wind. Wrong woman. Could Mrs. Banno have seen not the murder of Omar, but the attempted murder, or the staged murder of someone else entirely? Or had someone else died that day, hidden away or misidentified? Her mind spun. She thought back to Emma's faltering explanations about the sarcophagus, and the old gardener's strange memory of a woman in blue seen near the stables that same week. She remembered Lucy Armstrong, the vicar's goddaughter, terrified, receiving threatening notes that referenced justice and travel. And then a name surfaced. Lucy. Zubair, almost hesitating, shared that decades ago, Omar's brother, thought to have died young, had married briefly before his death. His widow, a Frenchwoman named Lila, vanished shortly after with their infant daughter. That daughter's name, Lucy. Sakina's lips parted in sudden recognition. Lucy Armstrong, she whispered, her thoughts now colliding in electrifying clarity. Could this entire series of events, the train murder, the freezer corpse, the poisoned doctor, be connected not by motive, but by bloodlines? A family inheritance perhaps, a grudge passed down, and finally enacted with brutal precision. The stage was never about hiding the murder, it was about displaying it, perfectly timed, cleverly manipulated, and above all meant to confuse. The killer didn't just want to get away with murder, they wanted the audience to clap. Miss Syra Mirza stood silently at the frosted edge of the tall window, her breath fogging the glass as her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Ashcroft Manor, an ancient edifice, crouched atop a withering hill like a beast waiting to pounce, barely visible through the creeping veil of the December dusk. The bitter wind howled beyond the stone walls, threading ghost-like whispers through the corridors of the centuries-old estate, and within that hollow sound, Syra felt the past stir, a past wrapped in deception, betrayal, and a truth so carefully buried it had rotted beneath layers of orchestrated silence. For weeks she had sifted through half-truths, missing documents, faded letters, and manipulated memories. But now, standing there in the dying light, it was as though the house itself exhaled its secrets into her waiting hands. "The trains," she murmured under her breath, her eyes narrowing. They were never random. Their schedules were designed to intersect. The murder wasn't a moment of opportunity. It was a performance, choreographed with brutal precision. The pieces began to settle, sinister and perfect, like bones falling into alignment. She turned from the window slowly, her spine straightening with quiet finality, knowing that with revelation came risk, because the truth wasn't just hidden, it was guarded. She rang the bell, her voice steady, as she summoned everyone to the grand drawing room, the room where the family portraits watched like silent witnesses from gilt frames, their painted eyes holding secrets no one dared name. The guests arrived, each with a different brand of tension clinging to their expressions. General Faizan Ashcroft wheeled in by a nurse, his lined face hardened by decades of command, but haunted beneath the surface, his gaze flickering toward the shadows, as though expecting them to whisper his name. His sons, Ibrahim, sullen and quiet with darting eyes, Ramiz, polished but too careful, and Dodd, the youngest, whose forced bravado failed to mask a deep unease, stood scattered, forming invisible lines of mistrust between them. Aliyah Ashcroft, statuesque and aloof, stood near the cold hearth, her arms crossed in rigid control, while Dr. Mariam Kaleem, composed, calculated, chose the farthest chair, her face unreadable, but too still. And by the door, the ever-watchful Mrs. Hanifa Gul lingered like a relic of forgotten truths, clutching a worn prayer bead between weathered fingers. Detective Inspector Raza leaned against the mantel with practiced indifference, but Syra saw the alertness behind his gaze. He was waiting for her. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, coiling through the room like a serpent. "Thank you all for coming," she said finally, her voice calm, but razor-sharp. "Tonight, we are not here to discuss inheritance or appearances, but truth. Not the version you've each crafted to protect yourselves, but the one that screams beneath it." The room shifted, some with discomfort, others with fear. This all began with a murder on a train, or so we thought, but the real murder didn't happen on the train. It happened between trains, at the precise moment two carriages passed each other at the Rutherford Junction. That wasn't chance, it was engineered. She paused, her eyes locking on Mariam. "Dr. Kaleem, or should I say, Meher Ashcroft, your records are forged, your degree, real, your identity, manufactured. You weren't at any medical conference, you were here, watching, waiting, executing." A ripple of gasps echoed. Aliyah stepped forward, her face pale. "That's not true. She's my doctor, my friend." But Syra didn't waver. "She's your sister, the twin who supposedly died in the fire. The same fire that conveniently erased her face and freed the family from the shame of her affair. But she didn't die. She escaped, changed her name, buried her past. And when your stepbrother returned, when he threatened to expose what had been hidden, she silenced him. Just like she silenced Dr. Sadiq, who recognized her from the clinic records he'd kept all these years." Meher's jaw clenched. "I never meant to." "But you did," Syra cut in coldly. "You engineered a murder between trains, then murdered again to keep it buried, and you used your so-called return to the estate as a cover for reclaiming a legacy that once rejected you." Inspector Raza stepped forward, his hand on his notepad, but Syra raised hers gently. "One last truth. You didn't act alone. Aliyah knew. She knew the moment you walked in who you were, and she chose silence, not out of fear, but out of greed." Aliyah's voice cracked, her composure fracturing. You don't understand. He was going to destroy everything. He was going to tell the truth, Syra said quietly. And for that he died. The room had collapsed into silence, not the silence of shock, but of realization. The lies had unraveled, the storm had struck, and outside, as the cold deepened and the last light faded from the sky, Ashcroft Manor stood hollow, and stripped of its shadows, its secrets no longer hidden, but exhumed. As the final chime of the grandfather clock echoed through the candlelit hall of Ravenscroft Estate, a heavy silence settled over the room like a suffocating fog. Each guest frozen in their place, their eyes now fixed on the trembling figure of Olivia Blackthorne, who until this very moment had gone by the name of Evelyn Carroway. It was him, murmured Cedric Holloway, voice strained. It was Julian Morgan. He knew her from before the war, before she vanished in France, under suspicious circumstances. That's right, added Inspector Hale, stepping forward from the shadows. Julian saw a photograph of the Winter Aid charity drive in the Tribune, and recognized her face instantly. His words struck like thunder. He came here not for reconciliation, but for leverage, for blackmail. Or perhaps he hoped for something simpler, whispered Drusilla Kent, her voice a trembling whisper, to rekindle a past, one she couldn't afford to acknowledge. We'll never know, said Hale solemnly, because Evelyn, or rather Olivia, had far too much to lose. All eyes turned slowly toward her, but she didn't flinch. Her hands clutched the fabric of her dress tightly, knuckles pale, yet her voice was calm, almost hollow. You think you understand, she whispered, but none of you know what it means to erase your entire existence just to survive. I didn't choose to disappear. I was forced. I believe you, said Miss Aldwych, the reclusive schoolmistress turned investigator, who had long watched in silence. You escaped a monstrous father, a life of abuse. You built a new identity, carved out peace in the ruins of war. But when you saw a chance to claim your place in the Blackthorne fortune, you reached for it, without realizing the cost. Olivia's lips parted, but Aldwych continued, relentless. The flaw was legal, but fatal. The will of Reginald Blackthorne divided his estate among his children. You, presumed dead, had no place. But as Olivia, a newly discovered cousin from France, you could be inserted. The draft of the revised will was found in Dr. Westmere's files. Reginald was preparing to amend it, just days before his mysterious stroke. Nonsense, barked Harold, but Aldwych didn't pause. Now consider the murder Julian witnessed, or thought he did, on the 6:17 train to Barrowgate, witnessed by none other than Mrs. Tilling, who happened to be in the adjacent train car. She swore she saw a woman being strangled, but what she saw wasn't real. It was a scene designed to be seen. Mrs. Tilling gasped. But I did see it. Yes, said Aldwych gently. You're a reliable witness, but what you saw was a performance. Olivia grappling with a tailor's mannequin, clothed in Julian's signature navy coat. The act was timed perfectly, as the two trains crossed on the Barrow curve. The window of illusion lasted just 12 seconds. But the body? Asked Cedric. Where was Julian's body found? In the root cellar, Hale answered grimly. Hidden beneath layers of ice. He was dead 3 days before the train incident. Poisoned arsenic, in a brandy bottle. Dr. Westmere discovered the timeline discrepancy when he reviewed the autopsy. He was preparing to speak with Olivia privately, until he too was found dead. Cyanide, traced to a vial in Olivia's quarters. Olivia's voice rose, desperate now. You can't prove this. We can, said Hale. The mannequin was found in the tower room. The same one where the maids reported ghostly noises, and the poison. We matched it to a tincture imported under your false name in Paris. Then, from the back of the room, young Clara Holloway stood. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. Inspector, the letters I received, threatening letters, I never spoke of them. But the script, I compared it to old birthday cards from Evelyn Carroway. The handwriting is identical. Aldwych turned slowly to Olivia, her voice like a blade. And Clara was once engaged to Edmund Blackthorne. Perhaps you feared she still had photos, evidence of who you really were. You didn't just kill for money. You killed to erase your past. Olivia's mask broke, her breath hitching. He wasn't supposed to remember me, she choked. But it was too late. The walls of deception had collapsed. Ravenscroft had given up its secrets, and in the hush that followed, as the candles flickered, and dusk crept back into the ancient bones of the estate, Olivia Blackthorne, born Evelyn Carroway, was no longer a mystery. She was a murderer revealed. As the last embers of the fireplace hissed in the chilled silence, Inspector Rhea turned to face the room, her voice steady yet low, like the wind curling under the door. No, it wasn't just about inheritance. It was about erasure, about rewriting history. Across the parlor, all eyes slowly gravitated to Evelyn Moreau, the woman they'd come to know as the charming guest from Devon, but who now stood unveiled as the vanished Evelyn Harwood, presumed dead for 25 years. Her face, half cast in shadow, revealed no remorse, only a weary calm, as if she had been waiting for this unmasking all along. "You took everything from me," she whispered, her gaze fixed not on the inspector, but on the man by the window, her brother Sebastian. "You told them I ran away, that I was unstable. You forged the letters, buried my name." The room remained breathless. "That's a lie," Sebastian muttered, though his voice trembled. Rhea took a quiet step forward, but not a clever one. The ledger at Grimsby Manor showed Evelyn's name, struck out weeks before her supposed disappearances. "The same week your father altered the family trust." Evelyn's smile was thin. "I had nothing, no past, no name, until I became Evelyn. I worked, survived, watched from afar as you inherited everything. Status, property, the legacy meant to be shared." A soft gasp came from Aunt Miriam, as the pieces fell into place like a quiet avalanche. Rhea continued, "The murder of Thomas Bell was no accident. He recognized you from the orphanage records. He threatened to expose the truth. You silenced him." Evelyn didn't flinch. "He was going to ruin everything. I had come too far." "And the body?" asked Miriam, voice quivering. "The garden well," said Rhea, "sealed with concrete weeks before the restoration. We found his watch inside, still ticking under the stones." Evelyn finally turned to face the inspector, eyes calm. "And what now? Will justice restore the years I lost?" Rhea's voice softened. "No. But justice, like the truth, doesn't answer to desire. It answers to fact." Later, as the snow drifted quietly outside the station cottage, Rhea and her assistant, Eliza, sat wrapped in silence. The fire crackled between them, as Eliza said, "She almost got away with it." "Almost." Rhea nodded, staring into the flames. "The mistake was subtle. The photo in the charity brochure had her reflection, not Evelyn's but Evelyn's scar, the one Thomas knew. So even the smallest clue," Eliza murmured, "can unravel the tightest lies." Rhea finished. She reached for her cup. "It's always like that. A thread tugged, a shadow out of place. People plan perfect crimes, but they forget one thing. Grief, anger, vengeance, they always leave fingerprints." Outside, the distant whistle of the night train echoed through the moor, a sound lost in memory and regret. And as the steam rolled into the fog, it carried with it the last breath of a truth, long buried but finally unearthed. A reminder that even when the tracks are hidden, the train of justice never fails to arrive.